Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Now, today I'd like to talk about the SWIFT sanctions on Russia and what this means for the future of international banking. Now, to understand this, we need to understand a few very important things about the banking sector worldwide, and we need to understand how SWIFT plays into this, as well as sort of general, the general history of SWIFT, right? So, the first thing you have to understand is that banks have a lot of processes around managing money, because if you make a mistake and you send the wrong amount of money out to someone, especially if it's out to a different bank, it can be a problem to get this money back, right? Especially if this is going over international borders and stuff like that. So the way things work is that you have a process of sign-offs, right? In other words, I may initiate a transaction, then that's going to get reviewed by somebody, then that's probably going to get reviewed by somebody else. And so you'll have multiple reviews and multiple sign-offs required for many of these transactions. So if you're trying to do this with a fax machine, then all the banks have to know what parties are responsible for signing things off on the other ones, and they're going to have processes to check that along the way, right? But if you can be assured that the banking system handled everything through their own software, which provides for all of these checks and balances, then you don't have to worry about any of that. And this is where SWIFT comes in. So SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide International Financial Transactions, and it started in the 1970s, and the basic idea was that it was going to be an organization in which every bank in the world would belong to no matter what. It wasn't going to be subject to politics, it wasn't going to be weaponized, it was going to be a worldwide financial system, a worldwide system for financially transacting money. And because it wouldn't be subject to weaponization, because banks couldn't get kicked out, it would give everybody the freedom to interact with each other, right? And so basically, banks built all their software up to handle all these checks and so forth through software processes that would eventually send things out in a particular file format out to SWIFT, and then the messaging would happen there, and then after that you'd have the payment settling process. But major point here is SWIFT solves a major communication problem for interbank transfers, right? And up until 2012, from 1977 to 2012, it was the only system of that kind. So basically this meant that everybody could be assured of access to being able to send and receive money internationally, because every bank would be a part, directly or indirectly, of the SWIFT system. Now, in 2012, something happened that was previously unthinkable. The Obama administration sorry. So in 2012, something happened that was previously unthinkable. The Obama administration managed to convince the European Union and Belgium to forcibly remove all Iranian banks from SWIFT as a way of trying to put pressure on the country to negotiate over its nuclear program. Now, this was the first time SWIFT had ever been weaponized, and the response was actually very dramatic, okay? But also very subtle. People had previously trusted that SWIFT couldn't be weaponized or wouldn't be weaponized, and that trust was broken. So in 2012, China began to build their own SWIFT workalike in order to interact with Iranian banks. They built it relatively quickly, and fairly quickly this system entered operation, and it allowed Iranian banks then to transact with Chinese banks for purposes of selling oil and other things, right? And so the key thing here is the trust that this would never happen was broken by the Obama administration, right? And the implication of this is that people stopped trusting SWIFT, and we began to slide down what I believe is a slippery slope. You have a hegemonic power that's declining, that now wants to sanction countries in the world to death, in that case Iran, and therefore is looking for things to weaponize that they couldn't weaponize before. And several countries recognized what was happening, and that's basically where you get this Chinese divergence. So President Obama killed the idea of a single worldwide international financial system which could be under the control of a government. I'm going to come back because that last part, could be under the control of a government, becomes really important when we're talking about where I think this is going to go in the long term. The second thing is, okay, so then we can fast forward 2 more years. You have the Euromaidan movement. Following the Euromaidan movement, you have the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which has been autonomous since 1991, by the way, declaring independence and then joining the Russian Federation. The response to this was to threaten to de-SWIFT Russia. Now that didn't happen in 2014, but the result was that Russia built their own SWIFT workalike, right? Because just like China wanting to import Iranian oil, Russia recognized that if they're in a position of being de-SWIFTed, they would need an alternative method for accepting payments for their own commodities in their own markets. So they built this. It was largely dormant, but it was a big project, and it kind of it entered testing phases in 2014. Shortly after that, eventually this system was rolled out in Russia, as well as within most of the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. And as a result, the Russian SWIFT equivalent has significant uptake pretty much throughout most of the former USSR republics, which are not part of the European Union. So Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all these countries have widespread access to the Russian SWIFT workalike. The next thing, though, is then you deal with de-SWIFTing Russia in 2022. And the fundamental problem here is, again, banks can't just fall back on manual techniques unless you already have a lot of contact between banks, who's allowed to sign off for these things, etc., that allow you to, you have to have the human protocols in place, and those typically aren't. So typically in this case, what you end up with is you end up with a situation of banks just simply not being able to do business with other banks. And you find that African countries in particular were complaining bitterly about this for a while, up through about mid-April. About mid-April, something happened, and both the complaints from African countries suddenly stopped, but also the Russian government made a statement that they would no longer publish the names of banks using their SWIFT workalike. Now, what that means is, very likely, many of these African countries are transacting business with Russia, not via SWIFT, but via Russia's similar system. And given the fact that it's just probably where you send the files, the overall changes required to the system are going to be relatively minor. Okay? They'll still be there, but they'll be minor, and presumably they're all now supported. So we can presume now that the Russian SWIFT workalike system is probably has significant inroads throughout the entire global south. And this has probably happened during this war. In other words, one of the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war geopolitically has been the financial integration of the global south and the inclusion of Russia in that group. So, what are the problems then with different regional powers having their own sort of SWIFT workalike? Biggest issue is that you have a degree of complexity which now has to be managed by all of the core banking software development teams, right? And because of this, you have the question of, if you have a batch of wire transfers that need to go somewhere, and some need to go via SWIFT, and some need to go via the Chinese system, and some need to go via the Russian system, how do you divide these and get all the files to the right place reliably so that everybody's happy? And so that requires code maintenance. That drives up cost of banking software, and consequently, this will drive up cost of banking services across the board. And it means that the dream of banking public infrastructure that SWIFT originally represented looks kind of dead at the moment. But will it be? I'm actually not sure. See, if you look at where the United Nations has done their best work, it's been in helping countries cooperate where they choose to cooperate. Things like the International Telecommunications Union, the International Postal Union. I actually thought that Trump withdrawing the U.S. from the International Postal Union was totally brain dead, because it's like, yeah, you can say you hate the United Nations, but this is about interactions. This facilitates interactions that aim at delivering international mail, right? And that's there's nothing to be gained from withdrawing from that. Same with the International Telecommunications Union. That's why you can pick up a phone in the United States and call and talk to somebody in Moscow, for example. It's that the United Nations basically has standardized all of the ways our telephony systems interconnect. So what about the United Nations picking up something like this idea of a truly inclusive banking system? Now, there are two aspects to this. The first is actually running the system, and the second is standardizing and coordinating. And I don't think the United Nations is in a good position to run a system. Okay? Just like the International Telecommunications Union doesn't run phone systems, I don't think an international banking union, which is what I'm proposing and advocating, should run banking message systems, right? But what an international banking union could do is it could standardize message formats. It could provide lists of sort of exchange addresses for each of the different messaging systems that are members, and it could provide things like testing suites and other things to help core banking software providers make sure that they can in fact integrate with all of the appropriate rules for all these appropriate systems. And so where I think this is likely to actually go is that great powers in the world going forward are likely to run their own banking messaging systems, right? These banking messaging systems, there will be a plurality of these. Many countries will end up having to integrate with multiple or all, and this will then be used to transfer money around the world in a way in which is resistant to these things like SWIFT sanctions, right? So what then does this mean, right? It means the United States would be able to sanction, transactions to Russia if they wanted, and so could the EU, but they could not apply those sanctions extraterritorially. In other words, you would no longer be able to say, Brazil, you're not allowed to do business with Russia anymore because we, the global hegemons, have said you can't. No longer be able to say that to Mexico, right? And consequently, this would completely undermine the ability for financial sanctions to apply worldwide. Probably a very good thing, because Western hegemony on the whole hasn't been very good. There are a few areas where it's been very helpful, but I think on balance, the negatives outweigh for most of the world and most people in the world. So what I think will happen is I think you'll get a UN group. It will focus on standardizing interfaces and providing this basic infrastructure. Major countries will likely run their own international banking message systems. I don't think the US will, because they can basically dominate SWIFT anyway. But Russia will, China will. I wouldn't be surprised if Brazil does at some point. India probably will just be, or they'll just adopt the Russian system. And this will be the sort of thing that'll go forward. And again, what this does is this contains the effects of sanctions. It doesn't mean that a country can't sanction another country, but it'll mean that the country can't use their sanctions to try to force everybody else in the world to go along with it, which is what we've been seeing since the 1990s in the United States. And even if you think it's great with Ukraine, keep in mind that the first case of this was against Cuba, right? And the whole point was to try to strangle Cuba by saying no companies with any presence in the U.S. are allowed to do business with Cuba. And so, these are the sorts of things that are one more step away from a U.S. global hegemony, right? Which the U.S. enjoyed really from the fall of the Berlin Wall, probably through at least the end of the 1990s. I would argue through probably 2012, 2014. So that's where I think things are going. Maybe you disagree with me. Let me know in the comments. Talk to you later.